Snow falls softly over Asheville. Inside a quiet mountain house, an old piano breathes again after years of silence. A white German shepherd puppy named Noelle stands trembling between hunger and hope, her ribs sharp, her eyes empty, a full bowl of food untouched at her feet. Beside her, a larger shepherd named Bruno refuses to move, guarding her like a vow made to God himself. The man at the piano has already buried his wife, already lost his faith in miracles. But tonight, his hands don't play for music, they play for life. One soul, one fragile breath, one moment where heaven leans in close. What happens next will remind you that God's miracles don't always roar. Sometimes they hum. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no soul, human or animal, should ever be left alone in the dark, subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope today. Winter settles gently over Asheville, North Carolina. It doesn't arrive with storms or drama, but with a quiet persistence that seeps into everything. On that December afternoon, the mountains stood dull and distant under a pale gray sky, their outlines softened by cold air and low clouds. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Frost clung to the shoulders of the road, and the scent of pine needles mixed with damp asphalt, sharp and clean, the kind of smell that made the lungs ache slightly with each breath. Downtown, Christmas lights were already strung across storefronts and lampposts, blinking faintly even in daylight, as if trying to hold their place against the long, dark season. Elias Moore drove west toward the outskirts of the city, away from the holiday traffic and into the quieter mountain roads. His old Ford pickup rattled softly beneath him, the sound familiar enough that he barely noticed it anymore. The truck bed was loaded with bags of dog food and a few dented metal bowls from a routine supply run for the county animal control office where he worked. At 51, Elias had learned the comfort of routine. It was easier than thinking too much. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a posture that hinted at old injuries and years of physical work. His face was weathered, defined by a square jaw and deep-set eyes that carried more fatigue than anger. A salt and pepper beard covered the lower half of his face, kept trimmed out of habit rather than care. His hair was cut short, mostly gray now, and his hands, large, rough, permanently nicked with small scars, rested loosely on the steering wheel. People who knew Elias described him as steady. Not warm, not cold, just reliable. He showed up early, followed procedure, and rarely spoke unless there was a reason. That hadn't always been true. Years ago, before grief took its quiet hold, he'd been quicker to laugh, especially around his wife Anna. But after her death 3 winters earlier, something in Elias had folded inward, not broken, just closed. Since then, he had learned how to move through life without asking much from it. The road curved gently ahead, lined with bare trees and tall pines that whispered as the wind passed through them. Elias's thoughts drifted without direction, the way they often did during long drives. He was thinking about nothing in particular when a flash of white near the roadside caught his eye. It wasn't movement at first, just contrast. He slowed instinctively, then pressed the brakes harder than he meant to. The truck came to a stop, hazard lights clicking on as he leaned forward, peering through the windshield. 20 yards back, near a shallow ditch filled with wet leaves, stood a large dog, and beside it, something smaller, paler. Elias exhaled slowly and cut the engine. The silence that followed felt wide and heavy. Wind brushed through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and then went quiet. He stepped out of the truck, boots crunching lightly against frost, and turned back toward the dogs. As he drew closer, the shapes sharpened into focus. The larger dog was a full-grown German shepherd, black and tan, tall and lean, with the build of an animal that had been moving and working long before it had been resting. His coat was dirty but intact, his ribs not visible, his stance solid. He stood directly in front of the smaller figure, body angled forward, ears upright, eyes locked on Elias. There was no barking, no lunging, just alertness, sharp and controlled. At the dog's feet lay a German shepherd puppy, no more than 4 months old. Her fur was almost entirely white, dulled by mud and cold, clumped in places where it had dried unevenly. She was curled tightly into herself, spine rounded, legs tucked beneath her thin body. A cheap plastic bowl sat a few inches away, filled with dry kibble that looked untouched. Elias stopped several steps away and crouched, lowering himself slowly so he didn't appear larger than he already was. "Hey," he said quietly, his voice steady and low. It's all right. The adult dog didn't move, but his muscles tightened subtly beneath his coat. Elias recognized the posture. Protective, not aggressive. A dog who had learned that standing firm was sometimes enough. Elias kept his hands visible and still. He shifted his weight slightly, careful not to rush. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he added. "Just want to help." The wind carried the smell of damp earth and pine between them. The dog's nostrils flared as he tested the air. His gaze never wavered from Elias's face. The puppy didn't react at all. That was what unsettled Elias most. He nudged the bowl gently with the toe of his boot, sliding it closer to the puppy. The kibble rattled softly against plastic. The sound felt too loud in the quiet. Nothing happened. Most starving dogs would have shown some response. A twitch, a sniff, a weak crawl toward food. This puppy didn't lift her head. Her eyes were open, pale and unfocused, staring at something beyond the road, beyond Elias, beyond the moment itself. Elias felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He glanced back at the adult dog and spoke again, softer now. "You've been keeping her alive, haven't you?" The dog didn't answer, but his stance shifted slightly, placing his body more squarely between Elias and the puppy. It wasn't defiance, it was duty. Elias respected that. He stayed crouched, letting the cold soak through his jeans, letting time stretch. After a moment, he extended one hand, palm down, not toward the puppy, but toward the space between them. The dog sniffed the air again, then took a cautious step forward. His tail stayed low, not tucked, not wagging, uncertain, but not fearful. "That's good," Elias murmured. "Good boy." The dog paused, then sat. It wasn't relaxation, but it was a decision, a pause in judgment. Elias shifted his focus back to the puppy and moved closer, inch by careful inch. When he finally knelt beside her, the smell reached him first. Cold fur, wet leaves, and the faint sour edge of dehydration. He brushed his fingers lightly against her side. She was cold, too cold. Her breathing was shallow, slow, each rise of her ribs barely visible beneath her coat. "Hey there," Elias whispered. For a brief moment, her eyes flicked toward him. There was no fear in them, no curiosity either, just emptiness. Then her gaze drifted away again. Elias swallowed. He had seen this before, though never often. Animals didn't stop eating simply because they were weak. They stopped when something inside them had shut down, when the will to fight had quietly stepped aside. He straightened slowly and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. Calling the shelter would have been the proper move. Protocol, procedure, but standing there on that quiet mountain road, daylight thinning and cold creeping closer, Elias knew leaving them wasn't an option. "I'm going to help her," he said aloud, more to the dog than to himself. The adult dog rose and stepped back just enough to give Elias space. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was permission. Elias slid his arms carefully beneath the puppy's fragile body. She was lighter than she should have been, lighter than felt possible. When he lifted her, she didn't resist. She went slack, like something that had forgotten how to hold itself together. The adult dog followed immediately, as Elias carried her to the truck, pressing close to his leg. When Elias opened the passenger door and laid the puppy gently on an old blanket, the dog jumped up without hesitation, curling his body around her, positioning himself like a wall against the cold. Elias paused, one hand resting on the open door, watching them. Two lives, balanced on a forgotten stretch of road at the edge of winter. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. The radio crackled on, spilling out the faint sound of a Christmas song, soft, imperfect, barely tuned in. Elias reached to turn it off, then stopped. For reasons he couldn't name, he let it play, low enough not to intrude, filling the cab with something gentler than silence. The truck pulled back onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the gray sky stretched on behind them, heavy and indifferent. Ahead, the road curved into the mountains, lined with pines that whispered as the wind moved through them. Elias didn't know it yet, but that road was already changing him. And in the passenger seat, curled against a dog who refused to leave her side, a small white puppy lay still, carrying the quiet weight of a life not yet finished. The county shelter sat on the eastern edge of Asheville, a low concrete building tucked between a storage facility and a line of bare sycamores. At night, it looked harsher than it really was, all straight edges and fluorescent glare, but someone had tried to soften it for the season. A string of multicolored Christmas lights ran along the front awning, a few bulbs already burned out, the rest blinking with stubborn cheer. As Elias pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching softly, the cold seemed to deepen, pressing against the truck like it wanted inside. He shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The radio had gone quiet. In the passenger seat, the adult German shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching. The puppy didn't move. Elias leaned over and touched her side again, checking her breathing, still shallow but steady. He exhaled and opened the door. Inside the shelter, the air smelled of disinfectant, wet fur, and old heat struggling against winter. Kennels lined both sides of the main hallway, metal doors rattling faintly as dogs shifted and barked, their sounds overlapping into a constant, restless hum. A small artificial Christmas tree stood near the front desk, crooked and undecorated except for a paper star taped to the top. It looked like an afterthought, but a sincere one. "Elias?" a voice called from behind the counter. Sarah Whitman stepped into view, clipboard tucked under one arm. She was in her late 30s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and a posture that suggested she rarely sat still. Her dark hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, streaked with early gray, and faint circles beneath her eyes spoke of long shifts and short nights. Sarah was the shelter's lead veterinarian, known for her blunt honesty and steady hands. She didn't waste time softening bad news, but she never treated an animal like a case file either. "What did you bring me this time?" she asked, her tone dry but familiar. Elias didn't answer right away. He opened the passenger door and carefully lifted the puppy, cradling her against his chest. The adult dog jumped down after him, staying close, shoulder brushing Elias's leg with every step. Sarah's expression changed as soon as she saw them. She moved quickly, swinging open the gate to the intake area. "All right," she said, already switching into work mode. "Let's get them inside." They moved the puppy onto an exam table padded with a thin towel. Under the harsh overhead lights, she looked even smaller. Her white fur had a yellowed cast to it now, her limbs too thin, her head too large for her body, in the way puppies are, except this wasn't healthy imbalance. This was loss. Sarah ran practiced hands over the puppy's ribs, spine, joints, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "She's severely underweight," she said. "Dehydrated, too. How long do you think she's been out there?" Elias shook his head. "Hard to say. Days, maybe longer." "And him?" Sarah nodded toward the adult dog, who sat calmly beside the table, eyes tracking every movement. "He looks better. He's been eating," Elias replied. "She hasn't." Sarah crouched slightly, letting the dog sniff her hand. "Hey there," she murmured. "You've been doing your best, haven't you?" The dog didn't pull away. He simply watched her, calm and alert. "German shepherds," Sarah muttered under her breath, "always holding the world together." She stood and motioned to a tech hovering nearby. "Get fluids ready and a warm blanket." As they worked, another man appeared at the doorway. Tom Delgado, the shelter manager, was built like an old linebacker, shorter than Elias but wide through the chest, with a thick neck and a beard that had gone fully gray without apology. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, and his eyes carried the permanent squint of someone who had spent years reading paperwork under bad lighting. Tom was practical to the core, a man who understood numbers, capacity limits, and the uncomfortable math of rescue work. He took in the scene with a single glance. "Full house," he said quietly. "Again." Sarah didn't look up. "She won't last the night without intervention." Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "All right, intake her. We'll figure the rest out." The puppy was moved to a smaller kennel in the treatment area, wrapped in blankets and connected to a slow IV drip. The adult dog paced once, then lay down directly in front of the kennel door, blocking it with his body, as if he could keep the world from pressing in. Elias leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching. The shelter noises seemed louder now, barking, metal clanging, distant phones ringing. He felt out of place, like he was hovering just outside something important. Sarah approached him, her voice lower. "She's not responding to food," she said. "We'll try again once she's warmed up, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "Sometimes it's not the body that gives up first." Elias nodded. He knew. "Trauma shutdown?" he asked. Sarah glanced back at the kennel. "That's my guess. If she doesn't engage soon, we're looking at assisted feeding. And that comes with its own risks." Elias rubbed a hand over his beard. "What about him? The adult?" Sarah shrugged. "Physically okay? Mentally?" She watched as the dog shifted closer to the kennel door when the puppy stirred slightly. He's carrying more than his share. They stood in silence for a moment. Somewhere down the hall, someone turned on a radio. A Christmas song drifted faintly through the shelter, tinny and uneven, barely cutting through the noise. The puppy's ear twitched once. Elias noticed it immediately. He straightened, eyes fixed on her. The movement was small, almost nothing, but it was the first sign of response he had seen. Sarah followed his gaze. "Well," she said quietly, "that's interesting." Later, after paperwork was signed and kennels were secured, the shelter lights were dim for the night. The dog settled into uneasy quiet. Elias hadn't left. He sat on the floor outside the puppy's kennel, back against the wall, boots stretched out in front of him. The adult dog lay beside him now, close enough that Elias could feel his warmth. "Bruno," Elias said softly, testing the name he'd chosen on the drive over. The dog's ears flicked, just slightly. Elias nodded. "Yeah, that fits." The puppy lay curled inside the kennel, chest rising and falling under layers of blankets. The IV line glinted faintly under the low lights. The Christmas tree near the front desk blinked on and off, casting soft, uneven color down the hallway. Elias didn't know what he was waiting for. A sign, maybe, or permission. Without thinking too hard about it, he began to hum. It wasn't a song he could name, just a simple melody that drifted up from somewhere old and familiar. His voice was rough, unused, but steady. The sound carried softly through the metal bars. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the puppy shifted. Her head turned slightly toward the sound. Her breathing changed, deepening just enough to notice. Elias kept humming, eyes fixed on the floor, afraid that if he stopped, whatever fragile thing had stirred might slip away again. The adult dog let out a slow breath and settled his chin on his paws. Sarah watched from the end of the hall, unseen. She didn't interrupt. Outside, the cold pressed against the shelter walls. Inside, beneath flickering Christmas lights and the low hum of a man's voice, something small and quiet held on. Morning came slowly to the shelter, not with light so much as with sound. The hum of the heating system deepened. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and keys clinked against metal as doors were unlocked one by one. Outside, Asheville remained wrapped in winter gray, the sky low and heavy, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Frost still clung to the edges of the parking lot, and the Christmas lights strung along the awning blinked weakly, fighting daylight they could not quite compete with. Elias had not slept. He sat in the same spot where he had ended the night before, back against the wall outside the treatment kennel, his legs stretched stiffly in front of him. His beard had grown rougher overnight, his eyes red and rimmed with exhaustion, but his posture hadn't slackened. If anything, he looked more anchored there, like a piece of furniture that belonged to the space. Bruno lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. The dog had barely moved all night, rising only once when a technician passed too close to the kennel, then settling again, steady and silent. Inside the kennel, the puppy remained curled beneath layers of blankets, her small body dwarfed by tubes and padding. The IV line continued its slow, patient drip. Her breathing was still shallow, but more regular now, each breath a quiet agreement to stay a little longer. Sarah Whitman entered the treatment area with a mug of coffee, clasped between both hands. Her shoulders were tense, her ponytail slightly looser than usual, dark strands escaping around her temples. She stopped when she saw Elias still there. "You didn't go home," she said. Elias shook his head. "Didn't seem right." Sarah studied him for a moment, then nodded. She set the mug down and checked the puppy's vitals, her movements efficient but careful. "She stabilized overnight," she said. "Barely, but it's something. Fluids helped." "And food?" Elias asked. Sarah's mouth tightened. "Not yet. We tried soft food early this morning. No interest." Elias glanced at the kennel. The puppy's ears twitched faintly, as if she could hear him thinking. "She reacted to sound," he said. "Last night." Sarah looked at him sharply. "What kind of sound?" "Humming," Elias replied. "Just humming." Sarah exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. "That tracks." Before Elias could ask, another figure appeared behind her. Mark Ellison, one of the senior shelter technicians, stepped into the hallway carrying a stack of folded towels. Mark was in his early 40s, tall and narrow, with long arms that made him look perpetually awkward in tight spaces. His hair was sandy blonde, thinning at the crown, and his beard was uneven, more habit than style. He was gentle by nature, known among staff as someone who spoke to animals the way others spoke to children, with patience and an instinctive softness. "She's the one from last night?" Mark asked quietly, peering into the kennel. Sarah nodded. "White shepherd pup. Severe shutdown." Mark crouched, resting his forearms on his knees. "Hey there," he said softly. "You're safe." The puppy didn't move. Bruno shifted beside Elias, lifting his head and letting out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not a growl, not a whine, just a breath shaped differently. Mark noticed. "That's her anchor," he said. "Him." Elias nodded. "He hasn't left her." Sarah straightened. "Which is why I'm not separating them," she said. "Even though technically we should." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Capacity and protocol," Sarah replied. "But sometimes protocol doesn't know when to step aside." The shelter door opened at the far end of the hall, letting in a rush of cold air. Tom Delgado entered, jacket still zipped, breath fogging faintly. He looked more tired than usual this morning, his gray beard uncombed, eyes shadowed. "Morning," he said. "How bad?" Sarah didn't sugarcoat it. "We're in a holding pattern. She's alive. That's all I can promise right now." Tom glanced at the kennels, at Bruno lying guard, at Elias still seated on the floor. "We're full," he said quietly. "You know that." Elias looked up at him. "I know." Tom sighed. "I also know when someone's already decided something." Elias didn't answer. Later that morning, after the shelter settled into its daytime rhythm, Sarah returned with a small dish of warmed broth mixed with softened food. She placed it just inside the kennel, close enough that the puppy could smell it without moving. "Let's try again," she said. The puppy didn't respond. Her eyes remained open, unfocused. Elias crouched closer to the kennel door. Bruno rose and stood beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. Elias hesitated, then began to hum again. The same simple melody as the night before, steady and unadorned. It filled the narrow hallway gently, weaving between barking dogs and clanging metal, like something fragile but persistent. The puppy's ear twitched. Then her nose lifted slightly. It wasn't much, but it was movement. Sarah held her breath. Elias kept humming. He didn't look at the bowl. He didn't rush the moment. He let the sound do what it wanted to do. The puppy shifted her head a fraction toward the food, then stopped. Her breathing quickened, then steadied again. After a long minute, she turned away. Sarah exhaled. "Still not enough," she said. "But she heard you." Elias nodded, though disappointment tugged at his chest. "That's something." By mid-afternoon, snow began to fall, not heavy, just a light scatter of flakes that melted on contact with the ground. From the shelter windows, the world looked quieter, softer, as if winter were trying a gentler approach. Elias found himself in Tom's office, standing awkwardly near the door. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. A single strand of Christmas lights hung crookedly across a filing cabinet. "You want to foster her?" Tom said, not asking. "Yes," Elias replied. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying him. "She's fragile. If she crashes, she'll crash hard." "I know." "And him?" "I won't separate them." Tom rubbed his beard. "You've never fostered before." Elias met his gaze. "I've never asked." Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "All right. Temporary foster, both of them. You keep us updated daily. Any decline, you bring her straight back." Elias exhaled, relief and fear mixing together. "Thank you." That evening, as dusk settled early and the shelter lights flickered on, Elias returned to the treatment area. He crouched beside the kennel one last time before transport. "I'm taking you somewhere quieter," he murmured. "Just for now." Bruno's tail thumped once, slow and deliberate. The puppy didn't move, but her eyes tracked Elias's face as he spoke. For the first time, there was something there that wasn't empty. Not hope exactly, but awareness. Outside, the snow had stopped. The air smelled clean, sharp. Elias loaded the dogs into his truck, laying blankets thickly, arranging everything with careful hands. As he climbed into the driver's seat, the radio came on again, playing a familiar Christmas tune, soft and imperfect. He didn't turn it off. The truck pulled away from the shelter, tires humming against cold asphalt. Behind them, the Christmas lights blinked steadily, small and stubborn. Ahead, the road curved toward the mountains and toward a house that had been quiet for too long. In the passenger seat, Bruno pressed close to the puppy, his body a solid promise. The puppy's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing slow but present. The night leaned in around them, cold and uncertain, but for the first time since Elias had found them on that forgotten road, the direction of the journey had changed. Elias's house sat just beyond the city limits, tucked into a shallow rise where the trees thinned and the road narrowed into something quieter. It was a modest place, one story, weathered wood siding faded by years of sun and rain. The porch light flickered when he pulled into the gravel drive, casting a weak yellow circle over the frost-dusted ground. Snow from earlier had already melted, leaving the air cold and clean, sharp with the scent of pine and wet leaves. The mountains loomed dark beyond the tree line, their shapes barely visible against the night sky. Elias parked and sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. In the passenger seat, Bruno lifted his head, alert but calm. The puppy lay pressed against him, wrapped in blankets, her breathing slow and even. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't worsened either. That, Elias told himself, was enough for tonight. He moved cheerfully, lifting the puppy first, holding her close to his chest as if she might shatter with a wrong step. Bruno jumped and down to beside him, circling once before settling near the front door, eyes scanning the darkness like he was memorizing the place. Inside, the house smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and something colder, disuse. Elias flicked on the lights, one by one. The living room came into view, a worn couch, a low coffee table scarred with age, shelves half filled with books he hadn't touched in years. And in the corner, beneath a thin layer of dust, stood the upright piano. It was an old instrument, dark wood dulled by time, its edges softened by countless small nicks. Elias had moved it here years ago, after Anna died, because he didn't know where else to put it. Since then, it had become part of the room in the same way a closed door becomes part of a wall, present but unused. He laid the puppy down on a folded blanket near the couch, placing a shallow bowl of water and a small dish of softened food nearby. He didn't push it toward her. He remembered Sarah's words. He remembered the way the puppy's ears had twitched at sound, not scent. Bruno lay down beside her immediately, positioning his body so that one flank pressed lightly against her side. His presence was steady, grounding. Elias watched them for a moment, then lowered himself onto the floor nearby, back against the couch. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed inward. It felt heavier than the shelter, heavier than the road. The puppy's eyes were open, unfocused. She stared past the ceiling, past Elias, past the room. Her chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. "All right," Elias murmured, mostly to himself. "We'll take it slow." Time passed without shape. Elias checked the puppy's breathing, then Bruno's posture, then the clock on the wall. Midnight came and went. He tried offering food once, gently sliding the dish closer. The puppy turned her head away, just a fraction, but the movement felt deliberate, a choice, even if it was refusal. Elias leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. The silence pressed in again. It was the same silence he'd been living with for years, the kind that crept into every corner once the world stopped knocking. He hadn't planned to break it tonight. It just happened. He began to hum. The melody came without effort, simple and low, shaped by memory more than intention. It wasn't a song he could name. It was something his mother used to hum when he was a boy, back when the piano had lived in their living room and the world felt smaller and safer. His voice was rough from disuse, but steady. The puppy's ear flicked. Elias kept humming, careful not to change the rhythm. He watched her from the corner of his eye. Her head turned slightly, not toward the food, but toward him. The movement was slow, uncertain, but unmistakable. Bruno lifted his head, ears angling toward the sound. He didn't move closer. He didn't pull away. He simply listened. Elias felt something tighten in his chest, sharp and unexpected. He didn't stop. Minutes passed like that. The melody filled the room, softening the edges of the silence. The puppy's breathing deepened, just a little. She didn't stand. She didn't eat. But she stayed present. When Elias finally stopped humming, the quiet rushed back in too quickly, like a door slamming shut. The puppy's gaze drifted away again. Elias swallowed and tried again. The melody returned, tentative at first, then steadier. Once more, the puppy's attention shifted. The pattern was clear enough to make his hands shake. He looked toward the piano. It had been years since he had touched it. After Anna died, the sound of it had felt unbearable, like opening a wound that never learned to close. He'd told himself he didn't need it. That silence was easier. Now, sitting on the floor of his living room, with a fragile life balanced between sound and nothing, silence felt like the crueler choice. Elias pushed himself to his feet. His joints protested softly. He crossed the room and brushed the dust from the piano bench with his sleeve. The wood beneath was cold. He sat down slowly, posture stiff, and lifted the fallboard. The keys stared back at him, yellowed but intact. He rested his fingers above them, hesitating. They felt heavier than he remembered, like they carried weight beyond their size. He closed his eyes and played the first note. The sound rang out, sharp and clear in the quiet room. Elias flinched instinctively, then forced himself to continue. The melody followed, simple and unadorned, the same tune he had been humming. His fingers stumbled once, then found their place. Behind him, he heard movement. He didn't turn. He didn't stop. The vibrations traveled through the floor, through the old wood, through the air. Elias imagined them reaching the puppy, filling in the hollow places where hunger and cold had carved too deeply. When he risked a glance over his shoulder, his breath caught. The puppy had lifted her head. Not much, just enough to look at him. Her eyes, still dull, were focused now, locked on his back, on the source of the sound. Bruno had shifted closer, his body angled protectively, tail resting against the floor. Elias kept playing. Slowly, painfully, the puppy dragged herself forward an inch, then another. Her movements were unsteady, her legs trembling beneath her. She paused, breathing hard, then gathered herself again. Elias's hands shook, but he didn't stop. She reached the bowl, her nose hovered over it, trembling. For a long moment, she didn't move. Elias held the melody steady, afraid that any change would break the fragile thread stretching between them. Then, barely audible, came the sound of teeth against soft food. One bite. Elias's vision blurred. He blinked hard and kept playing. The puppy took another bite, then another. Small, careful movements, like she was testing the world. When she stopped, she lifted her head and looked toward the piano again, eyes a fraction brighter than before. It wasn't victory, it wasn't recovery, but it was a beginning. Elias finished the song and let his hands fall into his lap. He didn't move. He didn't speak. Bruno lay down beside the puppy, resting his chin near her paws. The room felt different now, warmer somehow, like sound had rearranged the air. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, a house that had been quiet for too long remembered what it was like to listen. Elias sat there until his fingers stopped trembling. When he finally stood, he felt the weight of the night settle into something manageable. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He only knew that for tonight, the puppy had eaten, and the silence had not won. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky outside Elias's windows was a dull winter white, the mountains hidden behind low clouds that pressed close to the ground. Cold light seeped into the living room, touching the edges of furniture and settling on the piano like a thin film of dust had returned overnight. Elias woke on the couch with his back stiff and his neck sore, one arm hanging over the edge, fingers numb from the cold air that crept through the old house no matter how high he turned the heat. For a moment, he didn't move. He listened. There was breathing. Two different rhythms, one slow and deep, the other lighter, uneven but present. Relief loosened something in his chest. He pushed himself upright and looked down at the floor. The puppy lay curled on the blanket near the piano, her body tucked against Bruno's side. She looked impossibly small against him, her white fur stark against his darker coat. Bruno was awake, eyes open, watching Elias with quiet attentiveness. His ears lifted slightly when Elias met his gaze. "Morning," Elias murmured. The puppy's eyes fluttered open. She didn't lift her head, but she didn't turn away either. It felt like acknowledgement. Elias stood slowly and stretched, joints cracking softly. He moved toward the kitchen, filled a kettle, and set it on the stove. The house creaked around him, old wood responding to movement the way it always had. This was the hour he used to like best, back when mornings meant shared coffee and quiet conversation. Now, it felt fragile, like something borrowed. He prepared a small bowl of softened food, mixing it carefully with warm broth the way Sarah had instructed. He carried it back into the living room and set it near the puppy, close enough that she wouldn't need to move far. He waited. Nothing happened. The puppy's nose twitched once, then stilled. She turned her head slightly away, a clear, deliberate refusal. Elias exhaled slowly. "All right," he said under his breath. He crossed the room and sat at the piano. When the first note sounded, the puppy reacted immediately. Her head lifted, her body tensed, then relaxed. Bruno shifted his position, giving her space without moving far. Elias played the same simple melody as the night before, steady and unchanging, letting it fill the room. Within minutes, the puppy pushed herself forward, legs trembling. She reached the bowl and began to eat. Slow bites, careful pauses. Elias watched from the corner of his eye, heart lodged somewhere in his throat. By the time she stopped, the bowl was half empty. Elias let the final note fade and closed his eyes. The relief came with a sharp edge of worry. This wasn't coincidence. This was dependence. Later that morning, Elias called the shelter. Sarah answered on the second ring. She ate, Elias said without preamble, but only while I was playing. There was a pause on the line. How much? Enough to matter. That's good, Sarah said. And not good. I know, Sarah sighed softly. We're not going to rush her, but you can't be a full-time soundtrack, Elias. I have work, he said. I leave tomorrow. That's what I was worried about. Elias hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Outside, the clouds lifted just enough to show the dark line of the mountains. He felt the clock begin to press in on him, time suddenly sharp and demanding. By midday, the puppy slept, exhausted from the effort of eating. Elias sat at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out in front of him, feeding logs, medication schedules, emergency numbers. He filled them out carefully, his handwriting tight and precise. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the living room. A knock at the door startled him. Elias frowned and stood, pulling on a jacket as he crossed the room. He opened the door to find a man standing on the porch, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Morning," the man said. "Sorry to bother you." He was in his early 60s, tall but stooped slightly, as if years of work had taught him to brace against weight. His face was narrow, deeply lined, with a prominent nose and a thick gray mustache that drooped past the corners of his mouth. A short, grizzled beard framed his jaw, trimmed unevenly. He wore a flannel jacket layered over a faded sweater, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs. "Name's Walter Briggs," he continued, offering a hand. His grip was firm but careful. "I live down the road. Saw the truck last night. Thought I'd check in." Elias nodded. "Elias?" Walter's eyes drifted past him, toward the living room. "Heard the piano," he said. "Didn't know anyone was still playing that thing." Elias stepped aside. "Come in." Walter moved carefully, taking in the room with a slow, thoughtful gaze. His eyes landed on the dogs, and something in his expression softened. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains the music." Elias poured coffee and handed Walter a mug. They sat at the kitchen table, steam curling between them. Walter nodded toward the living room. "She yours?" "Not yet," Elias replied. "Foster," Walter hummed. "Hard cases." Elias studied him. "You've done rescue?" "Long time ago," Walter said. "Back when my hands worked better." He flexed his fingers absently. "Lost my wife 5 years back. Dogs were easier than people after that." Elias didn't respond. He didn't need to. Walter took a sip of coffee. "So, what's the problem?" "She won't eat without the piano," Elias said. Walter leaned back, considering. Animals find anchors. Sometimes it's a place, sometimes a smell, sometimes a sound. "I can't be here all day," Elias said. Walter nodded. "No, but maybe the sound can." That afternoon, Elias dug through old boxes in the spare room until he found what he was looking for. A small handheld recorder he'd used years ago, forgotten beneath. Dust and cables. He set it up near the piano and recorded himself playing the melody, slow and steady, from start to finish, then again and again. When he played the recording back, the sound was thinner than the real thing, missing weight and warmth. Elias grimaced. Walter listened from the doorway. "Might be enough," he said. "Might not." They tested it. Elias set the bowl down, pressed play, and stepped back. The puppy lifted her head. She listened. Her ears flicked. She stood. She took 2 steps toward the bowl, then she stopped. Her body stiffened. She turned, searching the room. When she realized Elias wasn't at the piano, she backed away and lay down, facing the instrument instead of the food. Elias stopped the recording. Walter exhaled slowly. "She knows the difference." Elias rubbed his face. I can't bring the piano to work." "No," Walter said, "but maybe you can change the rules." They tried again an hour later. Elias played the piano himself while the recording ran quietly in the background. Then he stood and walked toward the kitchen, letting the live music fade while the recording continued. The puppy hesitated. She froze halfway to the bowl, ears swiveling. Then, slowly, she resumed eating. Elias held his breath. By evening, they had managed one small success. The puppy finished a quarter of a bowl while Elias stood in the doorway instead of at the piano. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Walter stood to leave, pulling on his jacket. "She's learning," he said. "So are you." Elias walked him to the door. "Thank you." Walter waved it off. "That piano's been waiting for a job." Night settled early. Elias played one last session, longer this time, his fingers aching by the end. The puppy ate slowly, then curled up beside Bruno, breathing deep and even. Elias sat back on the bench, exhaustion settling into his bones. Tomorrow, he would have to leave the house. Tomorrow would test everything they had built. For now, the music had carried them through another day, and that would have to be enough. The alarm went off at 5:30, a thin, insistent sound cutting through the dark. Elias reached out and shut it off before it could ring a second time. For a moment, he lay still on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house answered with its usual noises, the soft tick of cooling pipes, the faint groan of wood settling, but beneath that was something else, a quieter rhythm, breathing. He turned his head and saw them on the floor near the piano. Bruno lay on his side, long legs stretched out, chest rising and falling in slow, even cycles. The puppy was tucked against his belly, her white fur catching the faint glow from the streetlight outside. She looked smaller in sleep, more fragile. Elias sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the moment. Today, he had to leave. He dressed quietly, pulling on his work boots and jacket, moving through the kitchen with practiced restraint. He warmed broth on the stove, poured softened food into a bowl, and carried it into the living room. The puppy stirred as he set it down. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpened slightly when she saw him. Elias crossed to the piano and sat. His fingers found the keys without hesitation now. The melody filled the room, steady and familiar, wrapping around the morning like a second layer of warmth. The puppy pushed herself up, swayed once, then moved toward the bowl. She ate slowly, carefully, the sound of her small bites grounding and terrifying all at once. When she finished, Elias didn't stop playing right away. He let the song carry on longer than necessary, as if trying to store the sound inside the walls. When he finally lifted his hands, the silence felt abrupt. He knelt beside her and checked her breathing, her temperature, the way Sarah had shown him. "I'll be back," he said quietly. He didn't know who he was trying to convince. He set up the recorder near the piano, pressed play, and let the recorded melody fill the room. Bruno watched him closely, head tilted. The puppy's ears flicked at the sound, but she didn't move toward the bowl this time. Elias felt the familiar knot tighten in his chest. "I know," he murmured. "I know." At the door, he hesitated. He looked back once more. The piano stood silent. The recording played on, thinner, less certain. Bruno shifted closer to the puppy, his body a steady line between her and the empty space where Elias had been. The drive to work felt longer than usual. The sky was low and colorless, the mountains barely visible through the haze. Elias kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts pulled backward, stretching toward the house. By the time he pulled into the animal control lot, his jaw ached from how tightly he'd been holding it. Inside, the day moved fast. Calls came in back to back, stray reports, a loose dog near a school, a cat stuck in a crawl space. Elias worked on autopilot, hands steady, mind split in two. He checked his phone more often than he should have, waiting for a message that didn't come. Around noon, Jake Morales caught him staring at the screen. "You all right, man?" Jake asked. Jake was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and a closely shaved head that made the angles of his face more pronounced. A dark beard framed his jaw, neatly trimmed, and his eyes were sharp, observant. He'd grown up rough, learned early how to read situations quickly. At work, he was efficient, sometimes blunt, but unfailingly loyal once he decided someone was worth the effort. "I'm fine," Elias said automatically. Jake snorted. "That's not the look of someone who's fine. That's the look of someone waiting for bad news." Elias hesitated, then exhaled. "Foster case," he said. "She's complicated." Jake nodded slowly. They usually are. At home, the house felt the absence immediately. The recording continued to play, looping the same melody. The puppy lay near the piano, ears angled toward the sound. She shifted, then pushed herself up and took a few steps toward the bowl Elias had left out. Halfway there, she stopped. Her head lifted, searching. The sound was there, but something was wrong. She turned in a small circle, confused, then backed away and lay down again, facing the piano. Minutes passed, then an hour. Bruno stood and paced once, then returned to her side. He lowered his head and nudged her gently with his nose. She didn't respond. Her breathing grew shallower, faster. The recording played on, indifferent. By mid-afternoon, the puppy's body trembled faintly. Bruno let out a low sound, deeper than a whine, edged with urgency. He moved toward the door, then back to her, then toward the door again. He stopped in the middle of the room and lifted his head. The sound that followed cut through the house. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a howl the way people imagine them. It was long and raw, pulled from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound shaped by need rather than noise. It echoed off the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. Down the road, Walter Briggs heard it from his porch. He froze, one hand on the railing, listening. The sound came again, unmistakable now. Walter moved faster than his joints liked. He grabbed his coat and crossed the distance between the houses with long, determined strides. When he reached Elias's door, the sound was louder, closer. He knocked once, then tried the handle. It turned. Inside, the house was wrong, too still. The recording played on, cheerful and hollow. Walter followed the sound into the living room. The puppy lay on her side, breathing shallow, eyes half-lidded. Bruno stood over her, head low, body tense, the echo of his call still hanging in the air. "All right," Walter said softly. "All right, I hear you." He knelt beside the puppy and placed 2 fingers gently against her side. His mouth tightened. "That's not good," he murmured. Walter looked at the piano, then at the recorder. He crossed the room and shut it off. The silence rushed in, heavy but honest. Walter sat at the piano bench. His hands hovered over the keys, uncertain. He hadn't played in years, not well, even then. But he remembered enough. He pressed a key, then another. The melody came out rough, uneven, but recognizable. Bruno stilled. His ears angled toward the sound. The puppy's breathing shifted, slowed just a fraction. Walter kept going, fingers stiff, timing imperfect. He leaned into the rhythm, letting repetition do the work skill never could. Slowly, the puppy's eyes opened wider. She turned her head toward the piano, confusion giving way to focus. Walter reached for his phone with his free hand and called Elias. Elias answered on the second ring. "Your dog called me," Walter said without preamble. "Literally, you need to come home." Elias didn't ask questions. He was already moving. By the time Elias pulled into the driveway, dusk had settled over the mountains. The house glowed faintly from within. He ran inside, boots echoing on the floor. Walter sat at the piano, shoulders hunched, face set with concentration. His playing was clumsy but persistent. The puppy lay closer to the bench now, head lifted. Bruno stood beside her, eyes flicking to Elias the moment he entered. Elias crossed the room and took over without a word. His fingers found the keys, smoothing the melody into its familiar shape. The puppy's body relaxed visibly. Her breathing deepened. Elias dropped to his knees beside her, checking her quickly. "Hey," he whispered, "I'm here." Walter stood, stepping back. His hands shook slightly. "She stopped responding," he said quietly. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did exactly right," Elias replied. Together they guided the puppy toward the bowl. Elias played. Walter steadied the dish. Bruno stayed close. The puppy ate a few careful bites, not much, but enough. When it was over, Elias leaned back against the piano, exhaustion washing through him. The day had tested the limits of everything he thought he could manage. Walter pulled on his coat. "You can't do this alone," he said gently. Elias nodded. "I know." That night, Elias called Sarah and told her everything. The silence, the sound, the way the puppy had faltered without him. Sarah listened without interrupting. "She's not ready to be without the stimulus," she said finally. "But now we know how deep it runs." Elias sat on the floor beside the dogs, phone pressed to his ear. "What happens if I can't be there?" "Then we build a bridge," Sarah replied. "Not a replacement, a transition." Elias looked at the piano, at Bruno, at the small white life breathing between them. Tomorrow, they would start figuring out how. For tonight, the house held its breath again. But this time, it did not break. Snow began falling again just after midnight, light at first, then steadier, as if the mountains had finally decided to let go of what they'd been holding all day. The road to the emergency clinic glistened under Elias's headlights, each curve demanding attention he barely had to spare. The puppy lay wrapped in blankets on the passenger seat, her small body pressed against Bruno's chest. Bruno sat upright, braced by the seatbelt Elias had looped awkwardly across him, his dark eyes fixed on her face, unblinking. Elias's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw ached. He hadn't planned this trip, hadn't wanted another night under harsh lights and harder truths, but the way her breathing had faltered again, too shallow, too fast, had left him no choice. Music had steadied her, but it hadn't fixed what hunger and cold had done from the inside out. The clinic sat on the far side of town, a squat brick building glowing white against the dark. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and hot plastic. A young technician met them at the door and guided them into an exam room without ceremony. Dr. Andrew Keller arrived moments later. He was in his early 40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a face that looked perpetually tired rather than old. His hair was thinning at the temples, dark brown threaded with gray, and his beard was neatly trimmed but uneven, as if grooming ranked low on his list of priorities. His eyes, however, were sharp and attentive, the kind that missed very little. "What have we got?" he asked, already reaching for gloves. Elias explained quickly. Shutdown, refusal to eat, response to music, partial feeding, collapse when stimulus stopped. Keller nodded slowly, listening without interrupting. "Shepherds," he murmured, smart enough to shut the world out when it hurts too much. They lifted the puppy onto the table. Under the fluorescent lights, she looked smaller than ever, her white fur washed nearly colorless. Keller's hands were careful but thorough as he examined her. He listened to her heart, checked her gums, pressed gently along her abdomen. "She's been starving longer than you think," he said quietly. "Her body's been conserving energy wherever it can. That kind of deprivation doesn't reverse cleanly." "Can she make it?" Elias asked. Keller met his gaze. "She can, but it's narrow." They placed her on IV fluids again, this time adding a feeding tube, a thin, careful line meant to deliver nutrition without forcing her to fight. Elias's chest tightened as they secured it, as if something sacred were being bypassed. Bruno paced once, then stopped when Elias placed a hand on his neck. "Easy," Elias murmured. "She's still here." The night stretched long and heavy. Machines beeped softly. Snow tapped against the window like a question without an answer. Elias sat on the floor beside the crate, his back against the wall, the familiar ache settling into his bones. He didn't have the piano. He didn't even have the recorder. So he sang. His voice was low, barely above a breath, the melody stripped down to its simplest form. It wasn't strong, it wasn't pretty, but it was familiar. The puppy stirred, her head shifting slightly against the blanket. Her breathing eased, just enough to notice. Keller watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You're not imagining it," he said. "Sounds regulating her, lowering stress. That matters more than people think." By morning, the snow had piled high against the curbs. The puppy had taken small amounts of nutrition through the tube. Her vitals were steadier, not good, but steadier. Sarah Whitman arrived just after sunrise, coat dusted with snow, her expression tight with concern. She listened as Keller briefed her, nodding along. "She's fragile," Sarah said, "but she's responding. That's not nothing." They decided to keep the puppy for observation through the day. Elias didn't argue. He didn't leave either. He sat, sang when he could, rested when he had to. Late afternoon brought a small miracle. The puppy lifted her head on her own and nudged the tube with her nose, annoyed. Keller noticed immediately. "She doesn't like it," he said. "That's a good sign." They removed the tube cautiously and offered a small dish of soft food. Elias sang. Bruno stood close. The puppy sniffed once, twice, then she ate. Only a few bites, but they were hers. By evening, they allowed Elias to take her home with strict instructions and a long list of warnings. The snow had stopped, leaving the world muffled and clean. Christmas lights blinked along the streets, reflected in wet pavement. At home, Elias settled the puppy onto her blanket near the piano. He didn't rush, he didn't test. He played softly, letting the house welcome her back. She ate again. A little more this time. Elias sat back, exhaustion finally catching him. He watched Bruno curl around her, felt the quiet weight of relief settle in his chest. They weren't safe yet, but they were closer. And for the first time since this had begun, Elias let himself believe that Christmas might arrive with more than just cold and memory. Christmas morning arrived quietly, as if it didn't want to risk startling anyone. Asheville lay under a thin blanket of snow that softened the edges of everything it touched. The mountains were pale silhouettes against a sky just beginning to lighten, and the cold air carried the clean, faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Elias's house stood still in the early hour, porch light glowing steadily, windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Elias woke before the alarm. For a moment, he didn't move. He lay there listening, the way he had learned to do over the past weeks, counting breaths instead of minutes. One deep, steady rhythm, another lighter, but no longer fragile. Relief came slowly, careful not to rush itself. He sat up and looked toward the living room. The puppy lay stretched out on her side near the piano, no longer curled in on herself. Her legs were loose, her body relaxed in a way that spoke of comfort rather than exhaustion. Bruno lay beside her, head resting on his paws, eyes open and calm. When he saw Elias, his tail thumped once against the floor, deliberate and controlled. "Morning," Elias said softly. The puppy lifted her head, not shakily, not with effort, just lifted it, ears tipping forward as if she were curious about the sound of her own movement. Her eyes met his, clear enough now that Elias felt something tighten in his chest. She stood. It wasn't graceful. Her back legs wobbled for a second, and she adjusted her stance, spreading her paws slightly for balance. But she stayed upright. She looked at Elias, then at the piano, then back at him again. Elias laughed under his breath, a sound that surprised him with its ease. He moved to the kitchen, prepared the food as he always did, and carried the bowl into the living room. He set it down and waited. He didn't go to the piano right away. The puppy looked at the bowl. She sniffed. She hesitated. Bruno remained still, watching. Elias crossed the room and sat at the piano. The melody came easily now, his fingers remembering what his mind no longer questioned. The sound filled the room, warm and familiar, settling into the corners like it belonged there. The puppy walked to the bowl. She didn't pause halfway. She didn't look back. She ate, steadily and confidently, each bite unhurried. Elias kept playing, his eyes fixed on the keys, afraid that even looking might break the moment. When the bowl was empty, he finished the song and waited. The puppy didn't collapse. She didn't retreat. She walked over and sat near the piano bench, tail resting on the floor, head tilted slightly as if she were waiting to see what came next. "That's new," Elias whispered. Later that morning, the house filled with small sounds that hadn't existed there before. The scrape of claws on hardwood, the soft thud of a tail against furniture, the occasional huff of a dog settling into sleep. Elias made coffee and stood by the window, watching snow slide slowly from the branches outside. For the first time in years, the day didn't feel heavy with memory. It felt open. A knock came at the door. Elias opened it to find Sarah Whitman standing on the porch, bundled in a thick coat, her dark hair tucked into a wool hat. Her cheeks were red from the cold, and she held a clipboard under one arm. "Christmas rounds," she said. "I had to see her myself." Inside, Sarah crouched near the puppy, watching her move. "Look at you," she murmured, "standing like you own the place." The puppy sniffed Sarah's glove, then sneezed, clearly offended by the smell of antiseptic. Sarah smiled. "That's a good sign." She stood and turned to Elias. "The vitals are solid, still needs monitoring, but she's crossed something important." Elias nodded. She ate without hesitation. Sarah glanced at the piano. "With music?" "Yes," Elias said, but she didn't wait for it this time. Sarah exhaled slowly. "Then she's learning that the world doesn't disappear when the sound stops." Another knock followed before Sarah could say more. This time it was Tom Delgado, scarf wrapped loosely around his neck, his gray beard dusted with melting snow. He stepped inside, stamping his boots. "Figured I'd come in person," he said. "Seemed like the right day." Behind him stood Jake Morales, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his broad frame filling the doorway. He glanced at the dogs and raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'll be damned." Walter Briggs arrived last, moving slower than the others, his coat buttoned crookedly, his mustache damp from the cold. He paused just inside the door, taking in the scene, the piano, the dogs, the warmth, and nodded once, satisfied. The living room felt small with everyone in it, but not crowded. It felt full. They talked quietly, about feeding schedules, about follow-up visits, about Bruno's age and health, about the puppy's future. At one point, Tom cleared his throat. "So," he said, pulling a single sheet of paper from his coat pocket and placing it on the coffee table, "we should make this official." Elias stared at the paper. He knew what it was without touching it. Adoption form. Sarah watched him carefully. "No pressure," she said. "You've already done more than most." Elias looked at the puppy, now lying on her back, paws in the air, batting clumsily at Bruno's muzzle. Bruno tolerated it with the patience of a creature who had decided this was his responsibility now. "I'm not giving her back," Elias said simply. Tom smiled. "Didn't think you would." Elias picked up the pen. His hand didn't shake. He signed his name. "What about her name?" Jake asked. "You've been calling her the puppy for weeks." Elias looked at her again. At the way she followed the sound of the piano, the way she stayed present even when it stopped, at the way she had chosen to eat, to stand, to stay. "Noelle," he said. "Because she stayed." Walter nodded. "Good name." They left not long after, one by one, boots crunching in the snow, leaving the house quieter but not empty. Elias closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the familiar rhythms again. This time, they didn't feel fragile. That evening, as dusk settled early, Elias sat at the piano once more. He played without urgency, letting the music wander. Noelle lay beside him, humming softly, a sound that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a howl. Bruno added a low note of his own, deep and steady. The sound didn't match the melody. It didn't need to. Outside, Christmas lights blinked against the dark. Inside, a house that had once been silent learned how to hold joy again. Somewhere between the last note and the quiet that followed, Elias realized something simple and irreversible. He wasn't rescuing them anymore. They had already rescued each other. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive loud and unmistakable. We expect thunder, light, something impossible breaking through the sky. But more often, God's miracles come quietly. They come through patience instead of power, through presence instead of force, through a simple choice to stay when walking away would have been easier. This puppy was not saved by food alone. The food was always there. What saved her was someone who did not give up when she could no longer ask for help. Someone who stayed, who sang, who believed that life was still listening. In the Bible, we are reminded that faith the size of a mustard seed can move mountains. Sometimes that faith looks like sitting on a cold floor, playing the same song again and again, trusting that God is still working even when progress feels invisible. In our daily lives, we all know what it means to feel empty while everything we need seems to be right in front of us. We know what it's like to lose our strength, our appetite for hope, our will to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, God places us in each other's paths so that we can be the song someone else needs to hear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might be feeling lost or tired today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you saw God working quietly in your own life. And if you believe in stories of healing, second chances, and small miracles, consider subscribing to the channel so more voices like this can be heard. May God bless you and keep you. May He bring comfort to your homes, peace to your hearts, and hope to every place that feels silent right now. And may we all remember that sometimes the greatest miracles happen not when we ask for them loudly, but when we stay long enough to listen. Amen.